Today I'm going to go over pluginizing all the things, and by that I mean I'm going to go over contributing to new plugins or finding new plugins, and then also going over some common plugins that will save you in your everyday development. So in case you missed it last time, I'm a developer at SeatGeek, and I also run operations. I'm a CakePHP core developer as well, and I normally work on the plugin site, and I'm also very active on GitHub. So if you have a GitHub project, I probably contributed it, or if you are working with something from GitHub, I probably have some of my code in your code. So yeah, I guess I'll start. Finding code, that's probably the biggest problem that most developers have. You really have to fight the urge to build it in-house, because you assume, okay, I can't readily just go on Google and then search for whatever it is and then find my code. So you really have to resist that urge and look for places where that code does exist. And the first place that you should look for is plugins.cakephp.org. This actually used to be CakePackages.com, and we've made it an official project in the past year. And right now I think we index 1,200 packages. Could be slightly off. And then I have like a backlog of 300 or 400 packages that I have to add. Essentially we have different categories of packages. So if you need some CRUD application, or if you need authentication code, or just anything really, we'll probably have it on there. And we also link off to wherever the package is originally. We only index GitHub projects, right? So the other place that you should look for directly is on GitHub. One of the things that I found when I was building cake packages is that there's no real good way to get an alert as to when there's a new package on GitHub for new stuff. So I would have to follow, 300 or 400 developers to see when they're putting out new code, new plugins, new packages, whatever, and then just find out that way. One of the other things you can do is you can follow the CakePHP project, and then look for every single developer that has ever looked or watched or forked the CakePHP project, because chances are they're going to have some CakePHP code, and in some cases it's going to be very, very useful stuff. I've actually found people who have like treasure troves of stuff, and that's how I know that the Japanese community and the Brazilian communities are very big, because you'll notice that they have a large quantity of followers, and then if you go click out on their projects, they'll have like 10 or 15 projects, so they're like probably bigger communities than in the US or the UK. So apart from that, and because you can't obviously follow an RSS feed of either of those things, what I set up is I have Google Alerts for new CakePHP code. And so I just set up like some search query like CakePHP plugin, and then I put in some search terms. I can remove sites. So I remove the bakery, I remove any of the CakePHP core websites, and I remove like some other like random sites like dzone or something. And then I'll just get like a nice list of new code. So for example, you could say, only show me stuff that's on GitHub that references CakePHP, and then just specify I want one list every day. And you'll probably get like 3 or 4 new plugins or packages that might fit your needs. And then on top of that, you can use Twitter and follow the hashtag CakePHP. It's surprising that like a lot of things don't actually pop up on Google Alerts, which is how I find things, and then they'll be on Twitter randomly. And if you just happen to be following at the right time, then you'll catch something that might be a gem. Some people actually release things on IRC. I have no idea why, because they tell people and they're like 10 people there listening, and then you'll use it and it's like, great, no one else knows about it and everyone forgot about it. But if you are an IRC, that's a place to find certain packages. And then the other thing is that early on when I was starting, I found that a lot of developers were coming up with guides or resources that said, here's what we use, or here's what I recommend for this. And a good example of this is Matt Curry. He has an ebook that right at the end he lists a couple plugins that he says, hey, whatever, you should go through these. I actually put together a CakePHP Bible myself with common packages that'll solve your problems. And so like that's a good way to do it. And then the other thing is that there are certain developers out there that will every week or every month put a roundup of releases or things that are going on in the community. And that sort of stuff you can follow, because then you'll just get like a nice batch update of useful code that you need. So as far as plugin requirements, I have a couple different things that I look at when I am evaluating whether or not I should be using the project within my project. And the first thing is, does it actually work, right? You don't want to import code that doesn't do anything, or doesn't do what you want it to do, or just doesn't even compile, because then you're just wasting time. So the first thing is, does it do what I need, right? Obviously, you don't want to import code that says it does X, but it doesn't actually do X. And it's really simple to look at that. If there is an issue open for that and it says it doesn't do X, well, it doesn't do X. And then you need to evaluate whether or not it's important enough that you can build on top of it, or if you just go from scratch. The other thing is that you have to make sure, does it break often? If it looks like they're doing a lot of releases all the time, or it looks like there are a lot of issues and they're unclosed, or the guy's like, oh, I fixed it in this release, then chances are that the project is very unstable. And then while you're using it, or whatever API you're using, if you upgrade, that'll break, and then you won't have any recourse. And the last thing is, if it's broken, don't fix it. Chances are that you came across a project that has been abandoned, and you don't want to have to update that legacy code from 3 years ago, because the person who's developing the project also won't want to update that code from 3 years ago. So just skip it, move on to the next one. Then I also look at the code base, right? So the code base is very important, because at the end of the day, something's going to break in that code while I'm working with it, and I'm going to have to fix it. And that developer is not going to be there. So I have to be able to make sure that it's something that I can read and I can work with. So for example, I have to have a standard syntax usage. A lot of this is like, does it always use tabs and spaces, or tabs or spaces? Does it have semicolons where it needs to be, or does it do some weird nonsense with PHP that like it's very non-standard, or not in projects that you're used to? So you don't want to be dealing with WordPress style code in your CakePHP code, and vice versa, because there's a cognitive dissonance there where you say, okay, here's a space here, and here's like random new lines, whatever, and then the rest of your code, it's one way. So the other thing is that you have to make sure it's a proper implementation of something. I've seen a lot of code that is dealing with some service, some web service, or some data store, and it happens to be a component. I have no idea why that is. It should be a data source, or it should be somewhere in the model, and it ends up being like a helper, which has like no value to me, right? So obviously that like is a first, like it's a starting point that says, okay, maybe this is not what I'm looking for at all, or maybe the guy has no idea what's happening. And then the last thing is that you have to make sure that it's very easy to install. If the code is not easy to install, or it has a lot of dependencies, it's basically useless to you, because then you have to remember every single time you're using this, oh, I need to install that package. Oh, I forgot to compile that like a binary. Oh, I forgot to move this in a certain place. So if it's just one standalone thing that you need to deal with, that's great, because then you don't have to worry about it again. But if you have to deal with multiple separate pieces, then it's kind of a hassle, and you have to move things around. So it's best to not deal with that sort of stuff. Then the next thing I look at is the user base, right? Because obviously you want to deal with projects that are well maintained and people are using and people love, right? So on GitHub you can see forks, watches, and they actually have stars now. And you can basically tell, okay, fine, this one has a lot of watches, there are a lot of people looking at this, there are a lot of people contributing back, right? And then once you know that you're like, it's a solid, it's a healthy code base, people are like actually interested in this continuing to work the way which it was supposed to work. The next thing is, are issues responded to promptly? If you open a project and then no one's answering any of the issues, and it has like 10 or 15 issues, and it's like a relatively new project, chances are it's going to continue to be bad, and you probably should just move on, go to another project. There's been plenty of like projects that I look at and it's like, great, the developer says it has all these features, whatever, blah, 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 and there's like all these corner cases that it doesn't solve, and the guy just doesn't even bother to answer them. He's just like, yeah, I'm not going to deal with it, whatever, leaves it alone. And then the last thing is there positive feedback? If I am at CakeFest and I'm talking to another developer and they just happen to mention something that's useful, and if they say, oh, don't use it, it sucks, that's probably a good telltale sign of saying that code actually sucks, because the guy's, he's not trying to screw you over, right? And vice versa, if you're at some place and someone says, oh yeah, I recommend this, it really did help solve my problem, then you should probably take a look at that, and it'll probably help solve your problem. Then we have documentation. Documentation is extremely important, because at the end of the day, you have to know how to use the plugin or the package or whatever, and you also have to know what is available to you, right? And one of the things I found is that a wiki is a very, very poor excuse for a README, right? Because like I frequently find myself in the subway and I'm working on something. I'm like, yeah, this is a great side project, and then I realize, oh crap, how do I use a feature? All right, let me look at the documentation. Let me look at the README. The README has a license, it has a description of what the project does, and then it has like some funny picture. totally not useful to me, right? I want like the configuration, how do I install it, how do I set it up, what are my options available, where do I get help, all in that README. And if I have it in a wiki, that's completely useless because I'm, again, in the subway, or I'm on the train, or I'm at the airport, or I'm somewhere where I don't have network, right? And a lot of places I hear they really restrict network access. So if you have to go online to find the wiki, that's kind of like a bummer because then you can't go online, you have to wait, whatever. The other thing is it has to have explicit usage docs. If it just says these are the options and it doesn't explain what those options do, that's also as useless as having the documentation not there, because then you have to dig into the code and really you don't have time for that. You just want to know this Boolean flag does X, right? It turns on caching, or it does whatever, right? And if it doesn't say that, if it just says these are the options, it's also pretty bad. So yeah. And the last thing is that I'd like to have documentation that's very, very easy to read. If it's very fluent style, like just writing, like this guy said, okay, here's some use cases that I've come across that are common. Here's some stuff that you'll come across, whatever, then that's great. If it's just like poorly formatted or whatever, and I can't look at it in the browser, or I have to like do some custom editing myself before it's readable, before I can see like code blocks or whatever, then that's also a pretty bad indicator of the code base itself, because then you won't be able to read the code base either. The guy probably has no idea what's happening. And then the last thing is like development. We want to look at like not just the code base and not just the user base, but we also want to know that the development cycle is really, really solid and good. So you want to make sure that the number of commits or the number of issues is decreasing as time goes by. If it's a relatively new project, the guy's probably going to have a couple issues, whatever, it's fine if it goes up. But if it's a stable project and it's been around a couple years or a couple months, and then you just have like an increasing volume of issues versus like decreasing, then the guy's really not paying attention to that, and he's kind of just like ignoring whatever. And so at that point you can say, okay, if I had a feature request, he'd probably also ignore that feature request. If I had something that I wanted to contribute, he'd also ignore that contribution. And so it's not really like indicative of a healthy code base. You want to make sure that there are recent commits, because if the commits were 3 years ago, then that's completely useless to you. If the commits were like within the past week or so, that's great. If the commits, generally you want to make sure that the guy's like working on the stuff. And then the last thing is you want to make sure that the developer is very easy to reach, either on IRC or Twitter, or like he responds to email or something, because you're going to eventually have a question about the code base, and either he won't be on the GitHub issues, but you'll be able to ask him really quickly somewhere else, like via email or whatever. So again, I guess I'm going to go over like 2 projects that I use like this style to like review, and one of them is actually one of my own. It's not related to CakePHP, but essentially it's a GitHub implementation in PHP, and my README is really, really crap, and it essentially says this is what this does. Copy it to your folder, and it gives you a license. I don't have any wiki. The last commit was from 9 months ago, and I'm not really paying attention to it. So there are like 15 issues, and I have no idea what's going on in there. The code base is more spaghetti code than anything else. Like I haven't played with it since I like sort of cleaned it up a little bit and then put it on GitHub. And then the last thing is there's no release. So that means that like I never expected it to be like a 1.0 thing. I never said, okay, this is done, people can use it, right? So that project's a fail. The other thing is CakePHP's debug kit. The README is kind of shady in that it points to a wiki. So then again, you have that issue where if I'm working offline, I need to download that wiki somewhere else, and then I can use it. It is, however, actively updated, and so I think the last commit was like 9 days ago or something, and then you know that, okay, fine, there's a last commit 9 days ago. That means people are actually still looking at it, whatever. And the developers who are working on it are really, really strong developers. They're all core developers, or they're very active in the community. So you know that you can reach them very easily, and you can say, I'm having an issue with X, and they're probably going to fix X, or they'll tell you, you're doing it wrong, do this. And then the last thing is that they're very active in closing pull requests and closing issues, either just saying, this is how you fix it, or this is invalid, or fixing the issue. So debug kit is a win. As far as contributing to projects, I contribute to like hundreds of projects throughout like a week, and one of the things I notice is that pull requests are largely ignored during the week, right? And that's for like variety of issues, but the biggest one is that we have day jobs too, and I personally cannot deal with the pull requests on my project. I probably have 50 pull requests across 150 projects, and I really don't have time to deal with that when I have work to do, right? So you should be also considerate of other developers who have work to do during the week, and they might not be able to respond to you, right? So when you're making a pull request, please be aware that it might not get responded to for about a week, maybe 2, depending on how or what the developer is doing at the time. You should probably have unit tests in your contributions, because if you make a feature request or if you make a pull request with a new feature and the guy's like, all right, great, this works fine, where's the tests, right? Then you can prove this actually works. It's not just me saying, here's a bunch of code, all right? You should always include documentation with any pull request or any new feature, because otherwise, the guy is going to be like, okay, fine, I have this new feature. He's just going to have a one-liner, or it won't even be documented. And then someone will come back later on and say, how do I use this random feature in your thing? And you have no idea how to use it. The guy has to come back to you. It's kind of annoying. So always include documentation in any contributions. And then lastly, when you make the pull request, remember to follow up, right? Even though the guy is probably, or whoever is probably working on it and has other things to do, they will forget about it if it's not in front of their faces. So remind them a week afterwards. Send them an email or something. Say, hey, I made this commit. Can you pull it in? Do you have any time to look at this? As far as releasing projects, if you are making open source code and you don't have it on GitHub, you're doing it wrong. Please put it on GitHub, and if it's not on GitHub, then no one can find it. If you put it on Bitbucket, no one uses Mercurial. If you put it on some SourceForge thing, no one's gonna search through SourceForge. So it's a version project. The same with Google Code. It's not very searchable. It's not very explorable. You can't really find that stuff. So if you put it on GitHub, at least it's in a central place. And especially for CakePHP related code, a lot of that stuff is already on GitHub. The core projects are all on GitHub. And so it's very easy for us to say, okay, fine, here it is. We already know where our code is. We can contribute to it. We don't have to make another account on some other website, right? Always include a README. Even if it's the barest bones of READMEs, always include one. At least that way I know, okay, this is something I contribute to, whatever. If a project doesn't have a README, it just doesn't really tell me anything. I don't even know if there's a wiki page for it, right? So at least if there's a README, it says, go to the wiki for the README. That's okay. If you're going to release something, have at least one test. That'll open up the gateway to having more tests. If you make a feature request or make a pull request to something and it doesn't have tests, and the guy asks, can you make tests for this? You're not going to make tests, right? So when you include one test, that allows other people to have that entry point into making new tests. Lastly, and I think there's going to be a Composer talk later, but you should use Composer for releases. And Composer is a really, really simple way of packaging up your CakePHP code and saying, here's how you install it, here's the dependencies. So you should definitely attend the talk and then also start implementing Composer in your projects, because then that way it'll, going forward, be more integrated into CakePHP projects. And one thing I would like to add to that is that you should probably, at the end of the day, submit it to plugins.cakephp.org. Even if it's not a plugin, it's just regular code, we'd like to index it, and that way other people can discover it quite easily. So now I'm going to go over some common plugins that'll solve some issues for you. And this one's CakePHP OAuth by using. It's actually a wrapper around another library that does OAuth support. So if you're trying to log in, users via Facebook or Twitter or GitHub or Stack Overflow, etc. OAuth actually does a lot of the legwork for you, and it's essentially like 10 lines of code in order to implement it, and it's super simple, super easy to use, and it's super easy to extend and add new providers for. There's really a lot of documentation there. And one of the things I liked is that Uzin is the guy who makes OAuth, and there were other people who were contributing strategies for this. I think the Facebook strategy was from some random person somewhere else. So that told me that the project was really, really healthy, really, really strong, and it's going to stay around for a while. And then obviously everyone needs some sort of Facebook login in their project for whatever it may be, or Twitter login or something. So it's very useful there. A lot of people actually on IRC ask, how can I upload an image? How do I resize an image? And there used to be a couple different projects for that. One of them was media, which I always found was a pain in the ass to set up, and I never actually have it working. The other one, which I contributed to before, and Juan still maintains, is Mayo Upload. And we sort of came into an issue where we just kept shoving in new features and never documenting them or never having tests. So we would add a feature and then break it, and then someone would be like, oh, why is it broken? Oh, I didn't even know it was a feature. So with the upload project, I tried to fix a lot of that and tried to take out a lot of the auto magic. And there's a large set of tests, so that way I don't break things. So it's very stable, and it works with every single CakePHP version. So it's very useful there. One of the other problems that we have is that we normally need to run background jobs, and I think there's a talk later about Gearman or something. But if you need to set up something small and light, Cake Rescue is very, very good for that. It runs on Redis, which has like native support for sets and lists. And essentially you just enqueue some job onto a job queue and give it some parameters, and it'll just go to work. And it's very, very easy to set up. Redis is also very easy to install. It's essentially just install the package and then start it, just like MySQL. And it's also very integrated with CakePHP, as all the jobs are just cake shells. A lot of the other background worker stuff is like a custom class that then loads up random stuff, and so it's very hard to ensure that that stuff doesn't break as you move between CakePHP versions. So I do recommend looking at Cake Rescue just as like a, not even a beginner, but like a permanent solution for job workers. And one thing that a lot of people do is that they compress assets, right? And Mark Story's Asset Compress plugin is very, very useful for that. It comes with a lot of pluggable backends for compressing things. So if you don't like Uglify.js, you can use whatever the hell it is that you want to use. And it like degrades gracefully. So if you're developing stuff, you can see the uncompressed, unminified versions. You can build the minified versions on the server if you need to, etc. And it integrates great with the CDN. You can specify, oh, I uploaded it to CDN in my project. I want to reference it as whatever. And it's also built into CakePHP, or not built into CakePHP, but very cake-centric. There are other asset compress utilities and plugins or whatever that use something outside of the core, and that's fine, but they're not really aware of the various differences between CakePHP and other frameworks, so it's harder to use. One of the other things that I like to do is run migrations or some sort of like schema database changes, and so it's easy to handle these with the migrations plugin. If you're like developing a large application and then you have to make changes live once a week, twice a week, and you make changes to your database, using the migrations plugin will be a lifesaver. If you're using schema, the schema class doesn't really handle any of that stuff. You sort of have to like hack it in order to make sure the table updates or whatever. And the migrations plugin actually makes sure that, oh, I can drop columns, I can add columns, add indexes, whatever, and also migrate the data itself. So you get callbacks before and after, so that if you add a new column and that's actually splitting up two columns, or combining two columns rather, then you can do that with the callbacks within the migrations plugin. So it's very useful there. There was a talk this morning about Elasticsearch, and I don't know if he covered the integration with CakePHP. So this guy, David Coleman, made an Elasticsearch data source, which integrates quite nicely with the CakePHP ORM, follows the same exact rules that you have for find and find by ID and read and all that stuff, does that stuff great. And it also really releases the power of Elasticsearch, so you can do faceted searches, you can use scripts in your searches and all sorts of stuff. So it's very useful in that like it conforms to the CakePHP ORM, but also expands on it and allows you to do the custom stuff that you can do with Elasticsearch. And a lot of other data sources that do that sort of stuff usually just like ignore the ORM completely and just have like random find methods. But this one integrates nicely, so you can move back and forth between MySQL and Elasticsearch with no real big deal. And lastly, there's a CakePDF, which is very easy to use, I think, plugin for CakePHP for generating PDFs. You essentially enable it, and then you install whatever dependencies it has, and then you just browse to the page, and you have a PDF version, right? There's a little bit more to that, but that will allow you to generate a PDF and do it in a way that is easy to cache, easy to use there. So, yep. Do we have any questions?
Possibly just talk a little bit about Composer?
No, there's a talk for that.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the talk for that's this afternoon in the larger room. So if you want to learn more about Composer, I would go there. Anything else? Cool.